on the cusp in the car. I'm driving across Virginia right now on I-81. Been thinking about back in 2015, 2016, in that era, how I went from touring in a Toyota Corolla to driving a big old truck with an RV and taking my family with me. So back then I worked for Joyride Golf Carts, a company in Nashville. I would do tours. So I'm working down there, and I just working for Uber in the winter, and that's really all I had going for me. I mean, I'd do some gigs now and then, and there was this artist, this country artist, and he would go play theaters out in the Midwest and out west and down in South Texas and stuff, and I had gotten to where I had been playing down in South Texas in the wintertime at them RV parks. I always looked forward to that, and I'd make enough money to justify it, so got me out of Tennessee, got me down there where I was working with just my guitar, and that was good for me. But this artist, I'm not going to get into who he was, but I'll just say this. He played classic, very traditional country music, and I barely knew how to play the drums, but I knew that if I could get in his band, I could get on some of them shows and play some of them theaters with him, and he was nice enough to let me open for him. So that's what I did. I offered that to him. I said, hey man, if you ever need a drummer, let me know. Now, I did not disclose that I can't play drums. That wasn't important enough for me to mention. So he did call me, and he asked me about a tour in the summer of 2016. My wife was pregnant with our daughter, and I would be actually taking a bit of a pay cut to go do this tour with him. So I was kind of anxious about, should I do it? And I thought, you know what, this is a great opportunity to go out west. And I noticed that on his schedule was Music Ranch, Montana. It's a place I had tried to play several years before. So I agreed to do it. Now, I did happen to have a kit in the barn. My brother-in-law had bought a drum kit and didn't have anything to do with it, so he set it off to the side in the barn. So I went out there and pulled a tarp off of it, and I started listening to them old songs and playing, and I said, well, I can do this. Just a brush and a snare. And so I practiced up and hopped on a tour bus, and there we went out west, and we pulled up to a South Dakota casino. And man, I think there was 700 people in that place. And all of a sudden the music started, and I started playing that drum, and I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. I mean, I ain't no drummer, but I'm playing in front of 700 people in South Dakota on drums. And it worked out. I'm sure it was rougher than I even thought it was, but we went to Music Ranch, Montana, and I got to open for this artist, and I remember I got up there and played a couple songs, and one of them I played was this song about 9/11 that I had written recently back at that time. So we played it, and after the show, a man he came up to me and he said his name was Frank, and he asked me how old I was, and I told him, and he said that would put me in the category of a millennial, and that made him interested in talking to me. Now, this man was in his 70s when he asked me that. So he handed me a big stack of like a book, not a book, but it was like a stack of papers stapled together. And he said that this is an idea he has for a TV show, and he would like me to read it and call him and let him know what I think. Now, this conversation as odd as it sounds, this conversation would change my life more than any conversation I had had up until that point, I believe. As far as the music business, well, look, I'm not even in the music business. I got to restate that. My music life, let's just say that. I'm not in the music business. I'm in the people business. So anyway, moving on from that. So this man, Frank, owned Music Ranch, Montana, and he had written up a TV show concept called Reconnecting Roots. And it's about reconnecting with the roots of what made America great. So he wrote this whole thing out, typed it up, and there's a lot of principles laid out in it. And he called it Facts in My Own Opinion. That's what he called it. And it was very interesting. And I actually aligned with everything in it. It was very patriotic, very principled to the Constitution and that kind of stuff. So I read it on the bus, and I called him back and told him that I thought, what I thought about it and stuff. And we set up a meeting for when he came to Nashville months later. All right, so that's jumping ahead a bit too far, though. While I was out there on that trip and we were in Paradise Valley, Montana, and we're on that tour bus, I remember some strange things were going on the bus that I didn't like. And one thing, they were making breakfast in the bathroom every day. I really don't know why. I can't remember. It just seemed like they had the bathroom door open and they were in there doing the breakfast. And I was also I had been in there a little while ago not doing breakfast. So I didn't like that one bit. So I ended up having my own snacks kind of tucked away. And they also had a rule on the bus that if you had snacks, they belonged to everybody. Now that's about the stupidest thing I ever heard. I'd buy stuff at the store and suddenly I'd go in there and they'd, what'd you get? And I don't like that one bit. I only share when I want to share. I don't like to share when somebody wants to take it. So I started getting real secretive and hiding my stuff. And I remember I did buy a chocolate milk jug and I drank out of it. It was like one of them quarts or half gallon things, but I just drank out of it, so hopefully nobody would drink out of it. And I remember I wanted to get out of there one morning, so I'd grabbed my chocolate milk jug that I just bought the day before, and I went outside down to the river and I sat there with my guitar. And I had this jug of chocolate milk, and I was just thinking about, I cannot believe sitting next to the Yellowstone River in Montana, and I'm a drummer on a tour bus with a jug of chocolate milk right here. Like, I was like, man, this is the life. Like a year ago, I had just come out of that job with working in a parts department, and I could have never even imagined this. But I quit that job and started driving for Uber and started making my own schedule, and my life took off. My son was very young. He was less than 2 years old. And my wife was expecting our daughter. And look, this was not a time of taking great risk in most people's lives. You got your nose to the grindstone and you're not taking big risks when your babies are being born. But this is suddenly when I started taking risks. So I was doing it backwards. But I'm out there drinking that chocolate milk, and I looked at the bottle, and it said, "Old fashioned never gets old." And I just went, "Whoa, hold on now, what? Old fashioned never gets old." And I grabbed my guitar and I went, "Old fashioned never gets old to me." And I started writing that song. And I tried to write the whole song by myself, and I liked half of it, I guess, but I didn't like the other half. I never could get it right. And I remember when I went back to Nashville, I got with my good friend Robin Collins, and she was the only friend at this time who would co-write with me that had anything going on. She was writing with all kinds of people. And she always would co-write with me. And she sat down with me and I said, I think I'd like to make this a duet with my wife. And we did. And that song, a few years later, would be recorded by Darren and Brooke Aldridge, a bluegrass group out of North Carolina. I had met them years ago and pitched the song to them during COVID. Turns out they liked the song and recorded it and would invite Amy and I to watch them sing it on the Grand Ole Opry stage. And I remember standing off to the side on the stage there, watching them sing Old Fashioned, and I just could not believe that all happened because I told this man that I could play drums in his band. I would have never got the idea. I would have never been sitting out there with that jug, drinking that chocolate milk next to Yellowstone had that not happened. So we jumped ahead quite a bit there. That was 2021 when I got to experience that at the Opry. So that's a 5-year difference between when I originally started writing it on the banks of the river. So let's go back to the river. I hopped back on the bus, and we ended up doing 4 shows in 2 weeks, which is actually not a lot when you're out on the road for that long, and I'm getting paid $250 a show. Our agreement was I got $250 a show, so basically it's $500 a week, and in 2 weeks, I mean that was a pay cut for what I could make back home in the heat of summer, where the tourism was thriving in Nashville. I left money on the table and I took this opportunity. And I remember the artist. I'm just going to tell you all this story. I really don't care what he thinks or anybody about this, but this is part of it. I remember on our way back, he had made an agreement. Before the tour started, he made this agreement. I'll pay you $250 a show. And he said, you can sell your CDs on the table after the show. You can open for me, do a few songs, and you can sell your CDs. And I said, wow, that's really nice. So after we had done all the shows and we were on the way back, he asked me outside of the bus, he said, how'd you do on your merch sales? And I said, well, I did all right. And that's all I said. He goes, well, no, how'd you do? How much did you make? And I was kind of uncomfortable with the question. I mean, I thought, well, okay. I said, well, I guess it's about $100 a show. I made about $400 total, and which was very helpful. You know, I needed that $400 cash on top of the $1,000 for the 2-week run, you know. And he goes, all right. And he wrote me a check for $600 instead of $1,000. He took the $400 out of what he owed me, and made sure I got $1,000. You know, and right now it kind of pisses me off to think about that, because you know it's like I said. Look, and maybe it's because I wasn't that good of a drummer. I don't know. But I had told him, hey, look, honestly, I'm not that great of a drummer. You know, I like to tell the story that I never played drums and I went and played. Truth is, I disclosed my skill level to him, and it was sufficient for what his music called for. So all I could say is, when you agree to pay somebody $1,000 and then let them sell their CDs on top of that, and then you take that money out of what you owed them, that's just messed up. And I never worked for him again. So there's that. And those are the things that happen. You get out there and stuff like that happens, and you come home and you go, well, and you have mixed feelings, and I feel bad. I tell my wife what happened and stuff. And it can feel like a failure. But it wasn't a failure. I mean, I look at what came from that trip. I met the owner of Music Ranch, Montana. I wasn't really even trying to. And he started talking to me pretty regular. When Amy and I recorded Old Fashioned The first time we recorded it on my phone. And because I had written it up there in Montana, and because it seemed to align with this TV show script, this random TV show script I had gotten, I decided to send that song to that man, Frank, in Montana. I thought, he might like this. So I told him the story. I said, Mr. Frank, I wrote this out there by the Yellowstone River, right down the road from y'all's place. Was inspired by that chocolate milk up there in Montana, and told him the whole thing. Well, he called me and said, Adam, we love this song. And he said, we would like to hire you and your wife to come sing it at my wife's birthday party in July. And I said, what? Just this song? He said, yep. Well, we couldn't believe that. So we loaded up the Corolla, the 2 kids, and he said he wanted to put us up for a week. And he'd pay for the trip and pay me. And I said, do what now? And he said, what do you need to be paid? And I told him, well, I didn't know how to price that. I mean, like I said, I'm not even I hadn't even been in the music business. I just go play shows for hardly nothing all over the country. And so I didn't know what to tell him. And I just said, well, sir, this is how much money I'd make if I stayed in town. And he's like, oh, okay. All right, yeah, no problem. And he didn't tell me how much he's going to pay me. And I just went, all right. So we got in the car and took off. And he told me, keep track of how much it costs to come here. Hotels and everything. And we drove all the way up there. And couldn't believe it. Me and my family went to Yellowstone. And, we just had a great time. And finally, his wife's birthday party come. Her name is Karen. Sweetest lady in the world, Miss Karen Smith. And it was her 80th birthday party. And we got up there, and in the crowd was Paul Overstreet, country music royalty. This is a songwriter legend and an artist that I grew up listening to. In the audience is also Rory Feek. My wife and I had looked up to Joey and Rory for years. And Joey and Rory would go to Montana and play at that place, and then Joey had passed away, Rory's wife, and now it was just Rory there. Paul Overstreet. So there's people like that at this event, which in my years in Nashville, I could never run into these people. But here I was singing our song in front of them. And they were very complimentary and nice, and got to meet them. And Miss Karen came up, and she told me that song was inspired by that chocolate milk brand. Now just think of this full circle of this. That brand of chocolate milk was created by her grandfather. He was one of the board members that created that brand of chocolate milk. And here, her family had something to do with the creation of this milk company that inspired this song decades, generations later. That the song got me the gig to full circle to come back around to play Music Ranch. Anyway, it's just a wild thought, I think. So Frank noticed that I drove a Corolla up there, and he started talking to me about this truck and trailer he had out there in the yard. And it was wrapped with Music Ranch, Montana, big advertisement thing, and it's all from the mid-2000s. It's probably about 12, 15 years old, this truck and trailer. And he said, this is just sitting here. And he said, as a matter of fact, you go down and play those RV parks in Texas. And he said, I'd be interested in you driving this thing down there. And I said, do what now? I couldn't understand what he was talking about. And when I finally wrapped my head around it, I said, well, sir, we don't drive things like that because that's expensive, to move that stuff around. I didn't know what he was hinting at. And I said, so we try to just keep our expenses low. As if he didn't know that, right? I'm telling him. I was like, that's why I drove that Corolla over there, and I pointed to it. And of course, a Corolla, a husband, wife, 2 kids, 2 guitars, all of our suitcases. I mean, I couldn't. We were packed in so tight in that Corolla. I had to hold a Coca-Cola out the window. I couldn't even fit it in there. So Frank's saying, well, look, he looked at that Corolla and he kind of smiled and he looked back at this truck and RV. He said, well, if you drive this, I'll pay your gas. And I said, do what? He said, take a look in there at that RV, see if you and your family could stay in there. And I was looking, I said, well, yeah, but why would you do that? I couldn't understand it. What do you mean you'll pay my gas? And he said, well, you know, if you're going to drive this around and advertise for Music Ranch, and I still to this day can't figure out where the benefit is to them. But that's what he told me. He said, if you fly here and come get this and drive it back, I'll pay for it to move around, and you'd be helping me out because you're promoting Music Ranch. And I said, well, I don't know if I can do that, sir. I was just so stunned. I couldn't say yes. I didn't know what to say. And he told me, okay, well, just think about it. You know, it's here. And we went home and we talked about it. And we ended up deciding this is blatantly obvious. The Lord brought this opportunity to us, it seemed like. So we went back. I ended up flying out there and getting this big old truck and this big old camper. And I'll never forget when I got there, it was all plugged up, ready to go. And I had never pulled no RV. And there's a 5th wheel on top of that. I didn't even know what that meant. And I got there and they were like, all right, there it is. There's the keys. I was like, well, how do I unhook this thing? They was like, oh, you'll figure it out. And I just took off across Montana and South Dakota and everything, driving this thing. And a buddy of mine, Ron, rode with me in the airplane, and he's riding back with me, and we both just couldn't believe it. Eventually, I asked Frank, I said, what in the world made you pick me to drive this thing around? And he had asked me, he told me the reason. He said, one time he asked me if this was when I had played drums there at Music Ranch. He said, was that your first time in Montana at Music Ranch? And when he asked me that question, I started to say yes, and then I said, well, actually no. And this was way back before I ended up driving the truck. So he's asking me this question, and it's playing into my future. The answer to this question, he doesn't know it, and I don't know it at the time. He says, was that drum gig your first time in Music Ranch? I say, yeah, well, actually, no. A couple years before that, I drove out here playing a bunch of gigs, and we came to the driveway of Music Ranch, and we actually gave some guy a CD who was out there weed eating, and we never heard back, but I was trying to play here way back then. And he said, now hold on, what? Say that again? You did gigs out here? Where? I said, oh, we just played some bars. We played a bar in Livingston. We played one in Three Forks, Montana. He said, how'd you book bars in Livingston and Three Forks? I said, well, sir, I just got on the internet and found them and called them and emailed them and booked them. He's like, what do you mean? And he was trying to figure out how I figured that out. I said, well, I wanted to go to Montana, and I was working my day job, and I had a week off. And then I knew I could take a few days off afterwards without pay. So what I did was I drove a 99 Nissan Quest with my guitar player and my bass player, Jerry and Lisa. And we basically booked a gig every day or every other day that paid about $300 to $400 a night. And we played these random bars just trying to go out west, and I was trying to expand upon places I've played and create a run for myself. I don't know. I just thought it'd be a good idea. And I said, turns out it was a terrible idea, because by the time I got there and got back, I didn't have any money. I done gave it to, you know, the gas in the van and the band, and they didn't make nothing either, to be honest with you. It's not like they got all the money. There wasn't no money to be had. And we slept in tents. Like, we were in Nebraska sleeping in a tent. The three of us. It's crazy. At the time, I didn't think it was. Now, we had 2 air mattresses in there, just so y'all know. Me and Jerry on one air mattress and Lisa on one over there. But actually, she might have had a mat on the floor. I remember. Anyway, I'm not going to get it. That was just some crazy times. So this all happened. I'm telling Frank about this. And he's hearing in me this adventurous spirit that wants to go and do crazy things. And I remember coming back from that trip very brokenhearted. And I told my wife, I said, I've been so excited. I booked this tour in January. I called it a tour. It was barely even that. You know, usually you call it a tour when you go places that people are expecting you. But everywhere we showed up, even the bars seemed surprised that we were there. But I think people we were working for didn't know we were coming. But I remember, I remember telling Frank that story and laughing about it, that it was a failed experiment. And he knew then, and he told me years later, that that's how he knew I would be the person to drive this camper and RV, or this truck and RV around, because he had this idea of doing mobile pop-up shows with the camper, you know, as part of it, which that's a whole nother podcast. But I'll just say this is on the cusp. And that's how I went from driving in a Corolla or a van and sleeping in a tent, or sleeping in the vehicle with the band, or sticking my babies in the back seat of a Corolla and my guitars in the trunk and driving cross country to do gigs. That's how I went from that to driving a big 60-foot rig sponsored by Music Ranch, Montana. That's how it happened. And I think the key element in every bit of it was I told a guy I could play drums when I couldn't. Had I not done that, I would, and I did. I went and played the drums. So it's not like I lied to him. I worked it out. But I don't know. Just take chances. That's all I can tell you.